Hi, everybody. Welcome to Shasai Podcasts, conversations between scholars from around the world who study childhood, youth, and related institutions historically. As an official production of the Society for the History of Children and Youth, you can subscribe to these shows through iTunes or Google Play. Written and visual materials associated with each episode are available at our website, shcy.org. Enjoy.
So, hi everyone, and welcome to this episode of the Society for the History of Children and Youth podcast. My name is Kristine Alexander. I teach in the history department at the University of Lethbridge, which is in Blackfoot territory in southern Alberta, Canada. And I am really excited to be talking today to Dylan Baun about his recent book, Winning Lebanon, Youth Politics, Populism, and the Production of Sectarian Violence, 1920 to 1958, which is published by Cambridge University Press. So Dylan is a political and cultural historian of the modern Middle East and Islamic world, and he is assistant professor of history at the University of Alabama in Huntsville. He received his PhD in Middle Eastern and North African Studies from the University of Arizona, and his research focuses on the history of youth and young people in the 20th century Middle East. So yeah, hi Dylan, thank you so much for talking to me today.
Of course, Kristine, thanks for having me. Appreciate you reading the book.
Oh yeah, no, it's an absolute pleasure, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation. So to get us started, really, could you just tell us a little bit about yourself, about your background as a scholar, and about the process that led you to become interested in youth in the Middle East, and to this book, essentially?
Yeah. So I'll take you back to undergrad because my uni days, because I think that's probably the easiest way to kind of situate things. So I was a history major, like many in our field, had a passion for history, whatever that means, but just loved studying the past, thinking about it in the relation to the present and whatnot. And while I was, I think it was, a junior in college, I studied abroad in Athens, Greece. And that was one of my first times outside of North America. So, I was blown away in all different types of ways. But also while I was there, took a trip to Egypt, and specifically Cairo. And that's where I would say I was really, really blown away in the sense that, the idea of a large cosmopolitan Arab and Muslim city, the size of New York, just, really, like I said, blew me away. I don't think I thought in those terms about the Arab world. So yeah, I was interested in history, but I think I went to Greece because I was like, oh, ancient Greece history, just like in very generic terms. And I feel like going to the contemporary Middle East was like, okay, this is an area I know nothing about. North Americans need to know more about the Middle East, given political engagements, foreign policy, whatever it may be, and this would be a very interesting part of the world to focus on. So that's how I got into the Middle East. How I got interested in Lebanon in particular was what I often tell my students was for all the wrong reasons that I kind of notice now, and those wrong reasons being a history of conflict, the Lebanese civil war, sectarianism in sort of primordial ways, like all of these tropes about the Middle East that we hear, and specifically about Lebanon. I was like, I want to know what's going on, and then obviously realized there was so much more to that, even though there were obviously more complex and nuanced ways to see that. So this led to my graduate degree in Middle Eastern history, Middle Eastern studies, both the MA and PhD level. And continued to work on Lebanon. And when I was doing dissertation fieldwork on a project on Lebanon, on popular politics, on social movements, things that kind of align with this book in a way, I saw in the archives a particular quote from a youth organization, a pamphlet that really stuck with me. And I mean, youth organization is sort of a term that I'm using, but they were just kind of referred to as a political party. And that quote was, with the youth by our side, there is no doubt we will succeed. And it was on the front page of this pamphlet called Ila al-Shabab, which is to the youth. And it really just kind of got me thinking that although I was interested in popular politics, I was interested in social movements, and I knew that kind of young people were a part of that. This quote really exemplified for me that at the center of a lot of these organizations, these youth-centric organizations, as I call them in the book, was youth and young people, targeting the youth, mobilizing the youth, controlling the youth, empowering the youth, all of these kind of different trajectories. And given that it was fieldwork stage, I incorporated a couple of that, incorporated some of that stuff into the dissertation. But a lot of it, especially, I think, some of the training and some of the reading and sort of seeing myself more so as an historian of youth and young people were things that definitely happened after the dissertation and in the early stages of my, scholarly career as a professor. So yeah, that's in terms of how I came to the topic, for sure. Yeah.
Thank you. So I think that you've just done a brilliant job there of leading into what I want to ask you about next, which is, tell us a little more about Winning Lebanon. So I will say that as someone who has studied youth organizations and also a little bit increasingly the question of political socialization of young people, I learned so much from reading this piece of work. So yeah, what's the book about? And I'd also love to hear, obviously what your arguments are, but about the kinds of evidence that you have used to make your arguments as well.
Yeah. So the subtitle of the book is Youth Politics, Populism, and the Production of Sectarian Violence, which is a little bit kind of on the themes, but beyond those themes and beyond that subtitle, I'd say the most direct way to kind of describe what the book is about a set of youth-centric popular organizations, as I refer to them, in the book in Lebanon in the mid-20th century. So I cover 7 organizations in total that sort of existed in the sphere of youth politics, populist politics, and this idea of the production of sectarian violence, which we'll talk about here in a second. So in terms of the arguments of the book, I think the most simplistic way to put it is that these organizations that I follow and the youth that participated within them matter in the history of modern Lebanon and the history of the modern Middle East more often. These groups and young people within the literature in Lebanon, especially from political scientists and political historians, are sort of conceived as pawns of bigger national, regional, and global sort of big power politics. And I find that when you actually focus on these groups and sort of take them at the center of the analysis, you can see a very different story, which is on their importance to these grand narratives within local politics, national politics, or regional politics within the broader Middle East. And I see their, as I said, they matter to the history, I'd say, in 3 particular ways. They matter in the production of a distinct type of popular politics, what I refer to as populism. All of these organizations in the mid-20th century, they were anti-elite, they were anti-status quo, they were anti-imperial, and they were centered around youth in terms of participants, but also issues around the youth question, if you will. What role in the 20th century are youth going to play in politics, the building of the post-colonial nation, whatever it may be. So I think that's the first way in which these groups are significant. The second is the role that they play in, and I think we talked about that, you mentioned this earlier in terms of your own work, the political socialization of youth and the broader socialization of different types of youth. So not just urban, middle class, the sort of ideal youth in sort of a modernist, universalist way, but rural populations, working class, the diaspora, and women as well, both working class and rural women. And third and final is that they were integral to what I refer to as the production of sectarian violence. And this is a more multi-layered argument, but I'll break it down kind of two ways, discursively and then in terms of their practices. So discursively, the way that, as the subtitle refers to, 1920 to 1958, this book culminates in 1958. There's 2 chapters on the 1958 war. And in the context of this war, discursively, the way that these groups described other groups and the ways they were described helped produce this thing that scholars refer to as sectarian violence thereafter. When I say the way that they talked about themselves and other groups, they often talked about their causes as just and the causes of other organizations and their youth as either sectarian and sort of narrow in a pejorative sense, or sometimes with coded language. I talk about this language of punks and gangs and how organizations refer to these other groups as punks and gangs, but what they're actually saying is that these groups are anti-modern, or they're sectarian sort of in a backward sense. And what this language did was it linked a category, youth and youthfulness, that was not often talked about in the same sphere as sectarianism, to sectarianism. And this idea that young people were prone to this sort of identity-based violence. And I see this happening in 1958. Of course, I mean, there's great scholarship out there for those who are interested on the history of sectarianism or the politics of identity, the politics and culture of identity in the Middle East that dates back to the 19th century. I mentioned Osama Makdisi, who wrote this great book about the politics of identity in Lebanon. But what I see as distinct in 1958 is this linking of youth to sectarianism, and that those young people are prone to commit that violence in their practices. So I think I said discursively, but it's also sort of tied to their practices, the way they describe, but also the way they sort of live that out through their rituals of violence. Yeah.
Oh, amazing. Thank you. So I think that as someone who doesn't have really a scholarly background in the history of the Middle East, yeah, as I've already said, I learned so much. And I think I was really thankful for the ways in which you really made that clear, that this is a really significant intervention that you're making about bringing those two things together, youth and histories or historiography of sectarianism. So yeah, that was great. What about sources? So I really
sorry.
Oh, that's okay. That's okay. So I loved how you engaged with and wrote about the print culture that produced and that was produced by, and that I would say it seems to have fueled a lot of these discourses and practices that you write about in the book. It was really evocative, and I'm just wondering if you can tell us a little bit more about the kinds of documents that you worked with.
Yeah, so the way I describe it in the book early is sort of the cultural productions of these organizations. So in sort of social sciencey terms for a second, my units of analysis are these organizations, and their sources or their production is what I'm most interested in. And that goes along all different types of ranges. The pamphlets that leaders of these organizations, or sometimes young members themselves, sort of rank and file members, created, the pamphlets that they read, also pictures. I use a lot of visual culture in the sense that, in terms of if we're interested in popular culture, what these types of organizations wear, where they're hanging out, who they're hanging out with, these types of things, I think visual culture is extremely important. And then you mentioned third and final, print culture, and specifically in the context of Lebanon, newspapers. What is great about studying Lebanon, in my opinion, one of my favorite things about studying Lebanon is the richness of print culture, and specifically newspapers, dating back to basically 18th, 19th century. A lot of these earlier productions were actually from associations, also from the French missionary tradition as well, and interesting in printing there. But by the 20th century, in the period that I'm talking about, if you wanted to own a newspaper and have a license in Lebanon, it was extremely easy. And hence, 6 out of the 7 of the organizations that I work on had newspapers. And the other one maybe never had a newspaper, but had other forms of print culture. So I think it's very helpful. And I think often in the past, in the context of Lebanon, because there's this diversity of print culture and diversity of perspective, a lot of scholars in the past, whether they're historians or not, have sort of decided we can't take these sources because they're too diverse. They're all pluralistic. They are so divorced from reality. But you know, as a postmodernist scholar and a post-structuralist, I mean, I think it's very easy to do that and talk about the role that these papers play in constructing these groups' identities, how they see themselves, how they see the world, how they conceive of their young people, other young people, and other organizations, whatever it may have been. So I actually thought that task was quite easy. And I think that we're going to see more and more works of historians in Lebanon that are conceiving of print culture in different ways, not as objective sources of reality or things that should be tossed out because they're too diffuse, but really interesting ways to, chart collective identity and youth collective identity. In particular, in my case, especially in the 20th century, before the war, where you do have this sort of flowering of the press.
Yeah. Absolutely. Thank you. Well, and I think what you said just there and how you talk about these sources in the book also just really makes it clear, as you've just said, that complexity and contradiction in this kind of against a backdrop of cosmopolitanism and capitalism, consumer capitalism.
Yeah.
It's the whole point, I think, of a lot of what your young subjects were living. And I love how you were able to capture that.
Thank you.
So yeah, so I'm not done quite yet talking about or asking you about evidence and archives. So I would love to hear some archive stories if you have any, or reflections on things that you learned by spending significant amounts of time in Lebanon. I think that knowing that your background, that you're not Lebanese, that you didn't grow up speaking Arabic, and so I think knowing this about your background helps to contextualize this conversation. And I also kept thinking of one of my most favorite articles that has come out in the past few years, which is Lara Putnam's piece from the, I think it's April 2016 volume of the American Historical Review, The Transnational and the Text Searchable. And it's basically about print sources and the risks that are involved or the things that might be lost when we actually don't travel to and spend significant chunks of time in the places that we are studying. So with all of that said, that was kind of a long preamble. Yeah, I'd love to hear more about your time in Lebanon.
Yeah. No, I think it's a very important preamble. And I was actually, when you were asking that question, I was just reminded of a tweet that I saw recently from a historian. I think he's at the University of Cambridge. He works on Algeria, French Algeria, and his name's Arthur Asra. And he has a really, really great, he's got a really great Twitter game. I love his tweets. They make me laugh, they make me think. And one that he brought up recently, which kind of reminds me of what you're talking about here, is he says, I'm paraphrasing here, this idea that everybody wants to go global until it's time to go to language class. That everybody wants to do this until it's easier to take these digitized sources. Speaking of the article you were talking about, or the costs associated with travel, and of course this is complicated by the COVID-19 pandemic and other questions about our footprint as academics, whether in conferences or field work. So understanding all that stuff and sort of putting that into the conversation, I couldn't stress enough how important it is to my own work to be able to go and work in Lebanon once every 2 years is basically what I've been doing since before the pandemic, and definitely more often even before the dissertation field work, when I was starting to realize I wanted to go to Lebanon. I mentioned Egypt, but I didn't mention that in 2010 and 2012 that I spent 2 summers in Lebanon. And this goes back to the language class point. my PhD was in Middle Eastern studies with a focus on history, and I think it's really important. And the disciplinary hat that I feel most comfortable wearing is definitely as an historian. But for those who study the global South and anywhere outside of the West and sort of Western languages, it is hard in a history program to get the language training you need unless you have an area studies background. So I think area studies is extremely important to me, my training and everything up until that point. But then when I was in Lebanon doing dissertation fieldwork, I was also taking language classes while there. And I think they were important not for the reading of newspapers, which at that point I was largely fluent in reading. Was actually in conversing with subjects, with my interlocutors, which were extremely helpful here, and with the sort of gatekeepers of different archives in Lebanon. And this goes back to your point on sort of archive and archival stories. Some of the archives that I use in the book are very simple to access and more bureaucratic than anything. I mean, sort of more rubber stamping than anything. So for example, the American University of Beirut that has a very, very rich holding of newspapers on microfilm, that was always easy to go to. You know, it was kind of a 9-to-5 thing. I just had to make sure that I had sponsorship there through my university, and it was easy to access. But other places, especially the National Archives, which held all the laws that govern these types of political youth organizations, were at state archives. And those are very hard to navigate, especially as you mentioned, I'm non-Lebanese, I'm a white dude. All of these things are very noticeable to my interlocutors anytime we're talking. And my spoken Arabic, of course, was getting better while I was there, but I'm still an English speaker. Accents can be detected, all of these things. But the fact, once you kind of get through that, it's sort of feeling each other out when you meet someone in the archives or whatnot. So say when I go to the state archives, for example, and the archival gatekeeper is saying, okay, this is some white American dude who's talking about youth politics, like maybe we should be hesitant. Once we start speaking, conversing, and not just sort of fluency of language, but I think taking conversation classes when you're in a place that you are doing archival work is extremely important, because you start to learn cadences, the way that people warm up to people, just generally speaking. And I used a lot of those things in order to get to the documents that I wanted to get to. And there was a lot of waiting around in many cases. So this has only gotten worse since I was doing my field work. Lebanon has rolling electricity cuts, sometimes 3 hours a day. I read a report today that in some parts of the city, it's upwards of 23, in Beirut, where I was doing a lot of my work, up to 23 hours a day of cuts, rolling cuts on and off. So, if the electricity is not rolling, an archivist isn't going to let you into their archive, right? So sometimes I'd have to wait 2 or 3 hours, sipping coffee, just talking about life with the archival gatekeepers in order to gain access thereafter. So I think it was extremely helpful in that sense, not only the being there, but the language classes, like I mentioned. And then just tied to your point about, ensuring that you go to these places, returning to them. Like I said, I go back every 2 years, every other year, during the summer. And that was extremely important in terms of translating the dissertation to the book. So, I read the dissertation. I mentioned to you that there was kind of a youth element in it, but it wasn't the centrality. And by the time I was on the job market, doing job talks, all that stuff, like I was talking more about youth. But in those conversations, I often got questions. Where are women? Where are anybody but sort of urban men? And I had the documents, but I hadn't thought they were, and this is going to sound really bad when I'm saying like this, I didn't think they were central to the story that I was telling yet, because I was thinking about masculine youth politics. But after that round of job talks, and people kept on asking about gender, they kept on asking about women, they kept on asking about like what's going on outside Beirut. It seems like you have a great understanding of urban politics, but what's going on where else in the country? And a lot of those questions spurred on further fieldwork research in 2016 and 2018. that was integral to the book. I mean, so for example, chapter 3, which is it's titled Broadening the Base, and it's all about that second argument that I was discussing about youth political socialization outside of urban men. That was all written after dissertation fieldwork and after these fieldwork trips. So not only going and being there, but playing trips back. And of course, like I said at the start, and I think it's an important way to end this question, this is all complicated by what's going on in the world right now. But I just know in terms of where my scholarship has come up to this point that it's been absolutely essential to be able to go, live, converse, and work with those documents in those places.
Mm. Yeah, thank you. So a lot of what you said there really resonated with me as someone who, with Simon Slight from King's College London, is co-editing this volume, A Cultural History of Youth in the Modern Age, forthcoming with to which, of course, you have contributed a brilliant co-authored chapter with Carla Pascal.
Oh, well, thank you.
About
couldn't have done it without your guidance. It's a great volume. I can't wait to see it in print, hold it, all that fun stuff.
Oh yeah, you and me both, seriously. Yeah. So Simon and I are in the final stages of finishing up our final chapter, which is entitled Towards a Global History of modern youth. And so these questions about kind of geopolitical power, resources, language, the dominance of English. So all of these things are really at the front of my mind right now. And I think that they're questions that, we need to maybe as a field, especially as, everyone is global now, or transnational, as you were saying, I think that we need to keep reckoning with them, maybe in a more intentional, explicit kind of way that talks about these, material inequities.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you. Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. And I mean that I'm guilty of it as well. I started off with that quote of going to language class, and obviously, I've been taking Arabic for years. But what I hope this book showed is that there's a lot of, and I think we'll talk about this later, but just sort of the similarities in youth culture across the 20th century. And I make these comparisons sometimes in the book, talking about, say, India, or talking about, other places that, it's one thing to make a reference, but it's another thing to actually explore those connections, and being fluent in those languages, being able to travel to those places and actually see that, as opposed to just like signaling to similarities so we can all feel we can all feel great that we're doing the same thing, but not actually knowing, because we're just reading secondary scholarship, we're not doing ourselves. So I mean, it's a tough thing to balance, and I love the importance of drawing these global connections, but then it's the real tangible work of how we actually get that done. And I think it's it's what you guys are doing in this volume, relying on a lot of scholars from a lot of different places that are versed in all different types of places, languages, archival, scenes, whatever it may be. I think that's the best we can do, besides all going back to language school and not teaching classes anymore, not doing our own research, whatever it may be. So yeah,
absolutely. And I think that I'm just increasingly convinced that one of the ways around this issue is collaboration, and writing together across boundaries of language, of institutional support, and of regional or national expertise. So, and I think that's one thing that you and Carla did beautifully, for example, in this highly anticipated forthcoming book chapter. So
you're really building it up here, Kristine. But it was great working with Carla. Obviously Carla works in Australia, and I mean, I had never collaborated in that way before, because I feel like our discipline is such sort of a single author, single book, churn it out type thing. And it's one of my favorite things I've ever done. Full disclosure here. I mean, you and I, we met through these workshops. We're friends now. We converse. We hang out in other spheres. So, I mean, it's collaboration has really sort of broadened my world. And this is kudos to the SHCY and just the field of youth and children, I felt so invited into this field. Like I feel like I'm sort of, like I was kind of mentioning, I'm kind of late to the game. In my first year of my professorship, that's the first time I'm kind of describing myself as a scholar of youth, and that was 2015, 2016. And I feel like super enmeshed in this field and the conversations and the collegiality. So collaboration is awesome. And B, I think that this is a field that is, we might not have all the answers yet, but I feel like it is more collaborative than some other fields that I've been a part of. So
yes, absolutely.
For what that's worth.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that this leads me just thinking about about this community of scholars and the people who will eventually be listening to or watching this conversation are, I assume, mostly people who are interested in young people in the past. So I want to ask you to talk a little bit more about a concept that you use in the book that relates to these questions about global history, but that is, I think, will also be of interest to scholars of youth, no matter how narrow, how focused, or how broad their geographical range is. But you talk about global grammars of youth. And I know that Simon and I, while working on this edited volume, this is a phrase that we found to be really evocative and that has helped us to think about some of the, epistemological, methodological, questions that come from writing about young people who are so central to the global political history of the 20th century. So tell us more about.
Yeah, it does have a good ring to it, doesn't it?
Ever, yeah.
I like it. I remember, I think it was 2 years ago at our roundtable at SHCY. I think Simon sort of set up, and I didn't even know he was going to say it. He was like, as Baun calls it, the global grammar of youth. I was like, crap, I need to stick with that now. So, I'm getting cited by Simon, because Simon's well versed in theories and in all different types of fields. So the fact that my name was being used in that way, I was like, I need to stick to this. But I was thinking I would actually just kind of read real quick, if that's okay, the section where I kind of break this down, and then we can kind of build off of it from there. So I'm talking about in the introduction, I bring it up in the introduction. I'm talking about changes in the public sphere in the late 19th and early 20th century that really changed not only young people's lives, but the way that youth is sort of conceived and its role in society. And I think this will resonate with a lot of people who work on this era. So I write, in the context of the late Ottoman Empire, in part due to centralizing reforms, mass migration to cities, a burgeoning public sphere, the introduction of liberal and emancipatory education, and the creation of a middle class, young people became, quote, free to do just that, be young. Their days became split between non-leisure and leisure time, and thus they were old enough to begin thinking about their role in society and what careers they would take on in the future. While this future was jeopardized in the midst of the Great War and the colonial period, being hip, mobile, and innovative became a way of life to escape that instability and participate in what I call the global grammar of youth. So that's more on the sort of front end of how we get to that. How do we get to that moment where this grammar of relating to young people in other parts of the world and sort of universalist and modernist ways became, something that young people in the Middle East definitely wanted to participate in, tied to all of these different types of things. And I discussed this probably most in the first chapter, where I set up all of these organizations. And I think if anyone was to read that chapter who works on youth organizations or just youth culture and youth political life, a lot of these things would resonate with them. Whether it was uniforms, it was reading groups, it was designating time for sports and for play, for leisure, for listening to music, for going to the cinema. All of these things are part of this global grammar that I'm discussing. This sort of way that young people are living in the early 20th century that is new in this time period, and that really links them to other places. Now, there's obviously differences within that. They're all sort of adopting this sort of universalist and modernist grammar that youth culture matters and that the young matter and that they can be the drivers of the future, which I think, definitely relates to your work on Girl Guides and scouting in North America and beyond as well. This idea of, okay, what can these young women or young boys in terms of these organizations, play in this sort of cultivating of building the nation. But then within that, of course, there's going to be differences. And in terms of my organizations, that you have this global language and global sort of practices of how to talk about youth and how to be young and how to be hip, but they're often prefaced on different solutions. So for example, I have organizations that I work on that I would describe as sort of thinking that generic fascism, not Nazism, but sort of this idea of discipline and order, state building, the state is absolute, all of these types of different things were the way to really build out and mobilize the youth. Where other organizations that I work on were very different in that solution. Some were, social democrats, some were communists. They had all different sort of solutions to how to solve this question of, how to drive the youth forward and how youth could participate in that. So again, building off of a similar language, that global grammar of what it means to be young and what it means to mobilize the young, but all sort of dictated by a different solution of how to solve the issues of that era.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. I think that another of the strengths of your book really is that it shows that you use these 7 organizations to show just, I think, really the value of a kind of a really fine-grained analysis of looking closely at them and looking closely at, both continuity, but also change over time, and the fact that those two things are sometimes not mutually exclusive.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, thank you.
Yeah, and I think that was definitely I definitely take sort of an organizational approach, and I think the pros of that are exactly what you're talking about, that fine-grained analysis of groups that have often just been conceived of as sectarian in a pejorative sense, as only political, not cultural, as only pawns, not drivers, whatever it may be. So I think it's really good in that sense. I think some of the things that I mentioned at the end that this book doesn't do is sort of get us into broader non-organizational youth culture in the 20th century in Lebanon, something that the book does not cover, and how they engage in different, because I think, as I mentioned at the beginning, this was a generation where many young people were in these organizations politically active, but not everybody was, right? And hence, those are things that are not captured by that organizational approach. So like anything, no approach is a silver bullet, but I think it does well, like you were saying, in terms of figuring out these contradictions and continuities in between what have often been seen as diametrically opposed groups, or just sort of like, very, very different.
Yes, absolutely. So I think that one of the claims that you make throughout this monograph is rightly about the significance of youth as lived experience, as a category, to these kind of pre-sectarian almost political moments, tensions in modern Lebanon. And so thinking of significance, I think that and building here on, I'm riffing here a little bit on Mona Gleason, and as on a keynote address that she gave recently at the HEX conference about agency and experience, hosted by the University of Tampere in Finland. And this is me getting us to the agency debate, in other words.
Yeah.
So, which historians of young people right now are really talking a lot about in
they are
really generative and productive ways. But so what Mona said was that she, and I think certainly this spoke to my kind of entree into thinking about agency and young people, was that the impulse to say that young people had agency, here it is, comes in a lot of cases out of our desire to demonstrate the historical significance of our subjects to people who study adults and who might be skeptical about these claims that the history of young people already is the history of politics, the history of economics, the history of warfare, all of these big so-called serious subjects, right? So I think, agency is, and I would say significance, those are threads that weave throughout this book. And you use Pierre Bourdieu's work, for example, to talk about the issue of agency and structure. So basically this is me asking you to tell us, what do you think about agency? And what does this book say about agency that will be of interest to folks who are following these heated debates among
I think they're great. I obviously started off the hour with being like, young people matter in my case. My subjects matter. Hey, read this book, So definitely understand the potential pitfalls of only kind of leaning on that. And I really do think that this is where Pierre Bourdieu's work really does help, this idea of bounded or structured agency. And I also understand, just to kind of preface here, the conversations that are going on about agency, kind of its positionality, that it's I feel like many at least the criticisms that I've agreed with the term, are sort of seeing agency in absolute terms. Youth matter, full stop, and we need to focus on them and not really conceive of this broader context that they're within. This sort of, guided by sort of liberatory, emancipatory sort of theories, and that individuals matter, full stop, as opposed to seeing this kind of broader context. So I think that's important to realize. But one way that I do think Bourdieu really helps, and those who've sort of adopted him thereafter, because he's largely talking about class, but I'm talking less about class in this context, is this idea of bounded agency, that the organizations, the young people that I focus on, they are shaping the world around them through their practices. Whether those practices are deemed as positive or negative by the populations at large, the broader population, given what time period it is and what's going on. So positive, when they are the drivers of change and they're building the nation and the French are gone and it's like, we're all great. That type of, political agency, if you will. But then also, pejoratively, as it's often referred to, when these groups are at the center of, violence, that these, as I mentioned earlier, that the young people and the organizations that they represented, the way they describe themselves and others, breathe this thing to life called sectarian violence. So they do have some agency, some leveraging, mobilization, whatever term you want to use there. But I think I do a fairly good job in the book of balancing this with the social structure that these organizations are embedded in. I talk about class and class distinction that happens within these organizations. So, for example, in particular organizations, those members who are deemed to be able to go on and be intellectuals and be, do the rhetoric and do the speeches, and those that have to, be the guards at the event and, like the security guards and, or just doing sports or whatever. So there is that sort of class distinction there. But also, social structure of Lebanon, and this will just be a quick overview for those who don't know much about Lebanon. So I say that this book is about the production of sectarian violence, but sectarianism as a government structure has existed in Lebanon since the late 19th century. It was brought on by the confluence of the Ottoman Empire, European powers, this sort of obsession with identity politics. These people are Christians, these people are Sunni Muslims, these are Shia Muslims. But then it does become embedded in the government structure, where, for example, in Parliament, up to this day, this changed after the war, half of parliamentarians have to be Muslims and half have to be Christians. So this is embedded in political practice. And these organizations can't escape that. They can shape it, and they can say, we are utopian, we are universalist, we represent the people. But then the question is, who are those people? What are those people? Who is in, who is out? And that is where maybe, if you want to think about it in basic terms, the structure sort of wins over the organizations. And not that they're doing anything mechanical thereafter, but that it really dictates the way they talk about themselves and they talk about the other. And that's, I mean, that's why I use this gerund in the title, Winning Lebanon, this idea that it's active, that it continues on, and it includes agents and it includes structures, but it's also about defining Lebanon, shaping Lebanon, but also being shaped by these government structures that, have been in existence and aren't static, but always what is fixed about them, I guess one would say, is that identity matters, and sect identity matters. Maybe how it's deployed or how much it matters is different, but the fact that it does matter is sort of a fixed thing throughout the 20th century. And hence these organizations are leveraging that, changing it, but also constricted by it. So a long roundabout way of saying shaped and shaped by, but I think these are very important conversations to have. And I think they're generated from the fact that our subdiscipline had to, feel like it had to prove our existence by saying young people matter. We're adults studying young people. But now I think we're at a sort of a moment where we can kind of step back from maybe that initial impetus that it has to matter to now that I feel like it's been recognized that young people do matter. But the question is, okay, how do they matter? In what ways? What are the pressures and what are the opportunities? What can they leverage and what is leveraging them?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. And I think that if we want evidence of, I would say, kind of the scholarly growing acceptance of the fact that, young people do matter, I think you can see it, for example, in the historiography of the Middle East. There are more and more scholars who are writing about histories of children and youth in that part of the world. And so as someone whose geographical expertise does not include the Middle East, I was fascinated by this work and by, the points of connection and difference that I saw with things that I had studied in different parts of the former British Empire. And so I'm wondering what you, as a historian of the Middle East, as someone, as you mentioned, with an area studies background as well, that what you think those of us who study other parts of the world, what we can learn from reading and engaging with histories of the Middle East.
Yeah. So I'll mention some of those names and some of those works because I think they're so important. So Nazan Maksoudian and her work on Ottoman children and youth, both in the late Ottoman period and in the context of the Great War. Heidi Morrison, who wrote a great book on Egyptian children, is now working on Palestinian children. Has always been working on Palestinian children, but is writing a book about that now. And Wilson Jacobs' work on youth organizations and young people in the context of Egypt, all have been very, very, very helpful to my own work. And I think in terms of the globe, I think the most important thing in terms of what I do in my teaching and my research is always desensationalizing the Middle East and the Islamic world, in the sense that conflict, violence, identity politics is always described in the West as complicated, as multifaceted, as we have to look at this angle of it, whatever it may be. In the context of the Middle East, especially in English language scholarship and English language media, and then I do think that this is also sometimes internalized within the context of the Middle East, is just these very simplistic answers. It is either primordial fixed identities or it is outside forces that have ruined the Middle East. And I think my book, although my book is a lot about conflict and it is a lot about identity and sectarian identity, how that comes to be, the path by which we get there is much more circuitous and much more nuanced, and not a foregone conclusion. I think that if you're reading this book and you didn't know the end of what happens to Lebanon, and you didn't read the production of Sectarian Violence point, there'd be a point when you're reading this book, you're like, things are looking good. Things are looking good for these organizations. Things are looking good for Lebanon. This is similar to a case that I work on where, there isn't this sort of pejorative aura around the country in the Middle East. I think that's really important to dwell on that, focus on that and highlight that period in the mid 20th century, where young people were seen as the drivers of change, and of course that had all different terms of power politics tied to it. But I still think it's important that they were, that they were seen that way, even if the conclusion is a little bit more depressing, if you will. So I think that's extremely important in terms of this idea of contextualizing that, and then kind of tied to what can those who read my book who do not work on the Middle East, what can they, what is important? I think it's those similarities that you were speaking of, and I think that needs to be prefaced by these points I've already talked about in terms of how to do global history, how to do rich global history. But I do talk about it in the introduction, so I just wanted to read something real quick because it's it's tied to this point. So I write, it's right towards the end of the introduction. I say, indeed, since the early 20th century Middle East, similarly to other parts of the global South, when categories of modernity, citizenship, nationalism, education were articulated in practice, young people have been agents for and a site of radical change. And I think that has been accepted full stop in other parts of the world, even in sort of like common discourse. Say in the context of the United States, I think people accept that young people were at the forefront of, the sort of 60s activism, even if they see it in simplistic ways. They don't judge it. But in the context of the Middle East, I think many people in the West would be like, oh yeah, youth politics, Middle East, we're talking about the Arab uprisings 2011, and like, that's it. Anywhere else, we're talking about states, we're talking about heads of states, we're talking about Gamal Abdel Nasser, we're talking about Yasser Arafat, we're talking about Muammar Gaddafi, Saddam Hussein. We're talking about all these big things and not actual either ordinary people, ordinary young people. So my book wants to, as best as possible, it seeks to add to that and say that these grand narratives that we've heard on the Middle East are not only factually incorrect, but just on top of that, much more nuanced.
Definitely. Yeah, definitely. And I think that relates to a phrase that I had noted in the epilogue of your book that I wanted to bring to the attention to the folks who are listening to our conversation right now, which is that you end with, I do love a good sort of manifesto-ish sentence, and I think that this is one of those. You end with a call to scholars to center youth and their politics in the history of modern Lebanon, but also in the histories of, and in our understandings of global politics in the 20th and the 21st centuries. So I think I think that's it. I think that there needs to be more of that. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about that, about what historians of youth with a global bent would do well to be working on right now, or should be thinking about, where's the puck going, to use a sports metaphor, which I never do.
Yeah, I was surprised when I heard that, but I loved it. Yeah. So I think first off, one thing I wanted to end with, those sort of manifesto statements. This is something that I feel like I've learned in the last couple of years of my writing. I think it's something to impart on all of our listeners, especially graduate students, like just being humble and sort of saying at the end of whatever research you do, like, this is what I haven't done and this is what I want others to do. Because I centered youth that were a part of these organizations, but I missed a lot because I was focusing on these organizations I mentioned earlier. So admissions I think are extremely important in making calls, but so just as sort of a writing practice, I would I would suggest that to everyone, because I think it's extremely important, and people pick up on these types of lines as sort of humble scholarship, but also forward thinking. And in terms of that forward thinking, I think it goes back to your agency sort of structure point. I think focusing on individuals and not in sort of like laudatory, celebratory, biographical ways, but microhistory I think is especially a way to go. I know that you're working on this because I remember the keynote you did a couple years ago, where you were following individuals who were writing love letters back and forth and family letters. And I think of course, when we're doing that type of history, focusing on the individuals that sources allow for us, the young individuals that sources allow for us, we have to make sure that we are thinking about the structure agency debate that we talked about, and that we are not just sort of seeing these individuals in a vacuum as the makers of history, but positioning them within their historical context. Because I think that we can, I'm starting to think more and more, I'm starting to be more and more convinced that we can learn much more, well, not much more, but we can learn a lot about an individual era, a theme, a practice, whatever it may be, if we intimately engage with the sources, not around just an organization, but an individual, and their worldview creation, of course, balanced with sort of the macro level stuff. So to that end, that is where my research is moving. It's actually something I wanted to talk to you about after this, if you got a few minutes. But I'm working on a micro history of a young Lebanese man in the 1960s, and his life intersects with 60s activism. It intersects with traveling abroad, and it also intersects with the history of the Lebanese Civil War. So, I mean, the question I ask, that I'm planning on asking in this project, and I'm actively thinking about right now, is like, what can the intimate and the individual illuminate about these broader trends? What can it confirm about the scholarship that we already know in any given field, and what does it challenge? What assumptions does it really break down? And accordingly, I'm working with new sources, less with print culture, much more with handwritten letters. And I think, as I've told you, that's been a doozy. It doesn't matter how good your foreign language skills are. If you can't read somebody's handwriting, it gets quite difficult. But I mean, it's been super fun stuff, and I'm really looking forward to that. But yeah, I mean, it is the type of research that I feel like at a particular stage of the sort of kind of traditional academic career that I have, through the professoriate, this types of research becomes easier to do. I'm going to focus on an individual, and now that I've written something else, I can convince you that this person matters. But I do think even more broadly that this should be a way not only to center youth as sort of a category of analysis, but individual young people.
You're preaching to the choir, man. Yes, absolutely, absolutely. As you said, I've been on a similar kind of a track from, organizational and prescriptive sources to ego documents and handwritten letters.
Yeah.
All of the
I need to start using that term more, ego documents. I've seen it more often, and sort of on blogs, on HNet stuff, and it's like, that is what I'm looking at here. So I need to kind of look at the literature around that as well.
Yeah. Okay. So yes, we will continue this conversation.
Yeah.
I think over the next months, years, which I'm really looking forward to. But yeah, I think that it's been almost an hour. Time when you're having some intellectual fun. So I think yeah, I'm just going to end by saying thanks again, Dylan, for sharing your work with us.
Thank you. Thank you for your great questions, and listeners, thanks for listening to it the full hour, if you made it this far.
Yes, exactly. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you for listening to Shisai Podcasts. You can find more materials and features from the Society for the History of Children and Youth online, shcy.org.